Welcome to a deep dive into the world of postmodern thought. We've got some excerpts from a Spanish language book about postmodern philosophy.
Oh, this is going to be fun, exploring these complex ideas.
Yeah.
Especially from a source in another language.
I know, right? It's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
But the book really jumps right in. It tells us to abróchense los cinturones y no dejen de mirar por todas las ventanías abiertas a su alcance que vamos a despegar hacia el inteligente corazón de nuestro mundo postmoderno, su pensamiento filosófico.
Wow.
Yeah, fasten your seatbelts and look out the windows. We're taking off into the heart of postmodern thought.
I love it.
So postmodernism emerged in the mid-20th century, right?
Yeah.
Challenging all those traditional philosophical systems and these grand narratives that we often take for granted.
That's right. And think about it. This was a time when, world wars, mass media, the Cold War, it really shook people's faith in those old ways of thinking.
That makes a lot of sense. Like the world was demanding a new way to understand itself, and
Right.
that's where postmodernism comes in.
Exactly. It's a shift from seeking one big unifying story to a focus on, the many different, sometimes conflicting perspectives that make up our reality.
That's so interesting. The book actually claims that postmodernism is a golden age for philosophy.
Really?
Yeah, it even compares it to the peaks of Greek, medieval Renaissance, and German idealist thought.
Huh.
What do you think about that? Is that a fair comparison?
Well, it's certainly a bold claim, but what I find fascinating is how it suggests that postmodernism isn't a decline,
Yeah.
but a blossoming of new ideas.
Okay.
It's about questioning those old certainties and exploring those diverse voices that were often silenced in the past.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into some specifics now. The book focuses on two key figures in postmodern thought.
Okay.
Jean-François Lyotard and Gianni Vattimo. Let's start with Lyotard.
Great choice. Can't talk about Lyotard without mentioning his groundbreaking book, The Postmodern Condition, published in 1979. It really helped define postmodernism as a distinct intellectual movement.
Okay, but before we get into his big ideas, I'm kind of curious about his background.
Sure.
The book mentions that he was a Marxist activist early on.
Yes, and that's actually crucial to understanding his later work.
Okay.
His early activism really shaped his thinking.
Okay, so he saw firsthand how these grand narratives could actually lead to unintended consequences.
Precisely. He saw how they could be used to justify violence and oppression, ultimately silencing those dissenting voices they claimed to champion.
Oh, wow.
And this disillusionment led him to develop a philosophy that focused on difference,
Okay.
the limitations of language, and the impossibility of a single unifying truth.
Okay.
This brings us to one of his most important concepts, the different.
Okay, the different. Now, I know that's a key term in Lyotard's work, but I have to admit it always kind of trips me up a bit.
I understand.
Can you maybe help unpack it for me?
Of course.
And for our listener.
Imagine you're having a conversation with someone,
Well-
but you're speaking completely different languages. There's no common ground, no way to translate your thoughts and feelings accurately.
Right.
That's essentially what the different successes describes, those disputes or conflicts that can't be resolved within a single framework or language game.
Oh, so it's like those arguments where you're talking past each other because you're coming from completely different perspectives.
Exactly.
Is that how it connects to his skepticism toward those grand narratives like Marxism or the Enlightenment?
You got it. He saw these narratives as attempts to impose a single unifying story on history, often ignoring those individual experiences that didn't fit neatly into the dominant narrative.
Oh, wow.
And he believed that this ultimately led to the oppression and silencing of those whose voices didn't align with the official story.
Wow, that's a powerful insight.
It is.
It makes me wonder about all the different language games we encounter in our own lives, especially now with the internet and social media. It's
Right.
like we're constantly bombarded with all these different perspectives and ways of understanding the world.
And that's why Lyotard's work is so relevant today, wouldn't you say? He gives us tools for navigating this complex information landscape.
I think so.
By understanding the differentiaire, we can be more aware of those moments when we're talking past each other, when those different language games are clashing.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. It's like he's giving us a new lens through which to understand those communication breakdowns. But okay, let's dive a bit deeper into his view of language. The book describes it as pretty radical.
It was radical.
He saw language as consisting of these diverse games with their own rules and meanings.
It was, for sure. And this really challenged those traditional notions of truth and knowledge. instead of searching for this one big universal truth.
Right.
Lyotard argued that meaning is actually created within those specific language games, within those local contexts.
So it's like realizing that different social groups have their own slang or codes.
Yeah.
The meaning is specific to that particular language game.
Exactly.
And that's where that example from the comic comes in, right? The one where the captain shouts, "Avanti," from the trench.
Yeah.
And the soldiers applaud like he's given a brilliant performance.
Exactly. That perfectly illustrates how those language games can be misunderstood or even misused when taken out of context.
Right.
It highlights how meaning isn't inherent in the words themselves,
Yeah.
but depends on those rules of the game, the shared understanding between speakers.
That's such a great example.
It is.
It's so simple, but it really drives the point home. So if I'm understanding this correctly, Lyotard is essentially advocating for those micro-narratives, for giving voice to the marginalized and unheard.
Precisely. He believed that instead of trying to force everyone into a single narrative,
Right.
we should celebrate that diversity of human experience and make space for those voices that have been traditionally excluded or silenced.
Uh-huh.
He saw this as crucial for creating a more just and equitable society.
That's pretty powerful. It makes me wonder how we can apply this to our own lives. How can we become more aware of those different language games we're playing and become better listeners to those diverse voices around us?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one we can continue to unpack as we go deeper into Lyotard's ideas.
Okay.
But for now, let's shift gears a bit and explore another fascinating aspect of his work. His interest in aesthetics and the concept of the sublime.
Okay, aesthetics and the sublime. Now that sounds intriguing. How does that fit into this whole picture of language games and challenging grand narratives?
Well, Lyotard saw art as a way to disrupt those traditional ways of thinking and reveal the limitations of language and reason.
So it's like art can speak to us in a way that goes beyond those everyday language games we've been talking about.
Exactly. Think about those times when you've encountered a work of art that, I don't know, just left you speechless.
Yeah.
Completely overwhelmed your senses, evoked feelings you couldn't quite articulate.
Right.
Lyotard argued that those are moments of the sublime.
Okay, so it's not just about appreciating beauty, but those experiences that push us beyond the limits of what we can grasp intellectually.
Precisely. For Lyotard, the sublime reveals those things that we can't quite grasp through reason or logic alone.
Okay.
And he believed that art, especially in the postmodern condition, could help us to embrace the uncertainty,
Okay.
the complexity,
Yeah.
the multiplicity of the world, rather than trying to reduce it to a single unifying truth.
That's pretty profound. It makes me think about how some of my favorite works of art are those that kind of challenge me, make me question my own assumptions.
That's a great point. It's not always about finding those easy answers or neatly packaged meanings.
Right.
Sometimes it's about embracing those questions, those mysteries, those things that resist simple explanation.
Okay. I'm definitely starting to see how these ideas can change how we approach art,
Good.
but I also keep thinking about how relevant they are to our daily lives, especially in this age of information overload.
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with all these different perspectives and ways of understanding the world.
You're absolutely right. Lyotard's work is more relevant now than ever. He offers those valuable tools for navigating this complexity and recognizing the limitations of our own knowledge.
And this leads us perfectly to the book's discussion of Gianni Vattimo, another leading postmodern thinker. His work builds on those ideas of difference and the limitations of grand narratives, but with some unique twists. I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with Vattimo. Can you give me and our listener a quick introduction to his key ideas?
Of course. Vattimo, an Italian philosopher, was heavily influenced by Nietzsche and Heidegger. One of his most important concepts is weak thought, or pensiero debole in Italian.
Weak thought. Okay, now that sounds counterintuitive. I mean, isn't the goal of philosophy to develop strong, convincing arguments?
That's a great question. It highlights how Vattimo really challenges those traditional assumptions about philosophy. He argues that in the postmodern condition, those strong absolute truths have crumbled. We can no longer rely on those grand systems of thought that claim to have all the answers. Instead, we need a more humble, more flexible approach to philosophy.
So weak thought isn't about being indecisive or lacking conviction. It's about recognizing the limits of our knowledge and being open to different perspectives.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that truth isn't this fixed, objective thing, but something that's constantly unfolding through interpretation and dialogue.
It strikes me that this connects back to Lyotard's emphasis on difference and the limitations of grand narratives, Would you say they're on the same page in that regard?
Definitely. They both critique those totalizing systems of thought that try to impose one single truth on the world. They advocate for a more pluralistic, open-ended approach to knowledge.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp weak thought. But the book also mentions Vattimo has a unique take on nihilism. And honestly, that word always has such negative connotations.
I understand that. But Vattimo flips the script on nihilism.
Yeah.
He doesn't see it as this negative force, this ultimate end of meaning. Instead, he sees it as a recognition of the limitations of traditional metaphysical systems.
So instead of despairing over the death of God, he sees it as an opportunity. That's a pretty radical reframing.
It is. It's an opportunity to develop a less rigid, more open, and more tolerant worldview.
Wow. I'm starting to see how this connects to what we were discussing about those grand narratives. If we let go of those absolute truths that are often used to justify exclusion and oppression, we can create space for new, more inclusive ways of understanding the world.
That's a really insightful connection. It's about recognizing that our understanding of the world is always evolving.
Yeah.
And being willing to challenge those traditional ways of thinking that no longer serve us.
This is making me think about how important it is to be critical of information, especially online. Right.
There's so much out there, and it can be hard to know what to trust.
That's another reason why Vattimo's work is so relevant today. Weak thought encourages us to be critical thinkers, to question those easy answers, and to be open to multiple perspectives.
So it's not about giving up on truth altogether,
No.
but about recognizing that it's something we constantly negotiate and reinterpret through dialogue and engagement with different perspectives.
You got it. And this is where Vattimo's perspective on technology comes in. He actually had a surprisingly optimistic view of technology, especially compared to other postmodern thinkers.
Really? That's unexpected. Most postmodern thinkers seem to be pretty skeptical of technology.
I know, right? But Vattimo believed that technology, especially mass media, could contribute to the weakening of dominant ideologies.
Okay.
And the emergence of more diverse perspectives.
So he saw technology as a potential tool for empowering those marginalized voices and challenging those traditional power structures.
That's fascinating.
Precisely. He argued that technology, especially the internet, could create new spaces for those language games to interact, to challenge each other, and to generate new meanings and understandings.
That makes me think about the role of social media today. It can be used to spread misinformation, but it also has the power to amplify marginalized voices and connect people across geographical and cultural boundaries.
That's a perfect example of the double-edged sword of technology. It's a tool that can be used for good or for ill, and it's up to us to use it wisely.
So in a way, Vattimo is suggesting that technology can help us to put those postmodern ideas into practice.
Yeah.
To create a more pluralistic and inclusive world.
I think that's a fair interpretation. He was definitely more optimistic about the potential of technology to contribute to positive social change than some of his contemporaries.
It's amazing how these ideas are all coming together. It's like we're building a framework for understanding not just postmodern thought, but the world around us.
I agree. And it's a framework that encourages us to be critical thinkers, to be open to new perspectives, and to engage with the world in a more nuanced, compassionate way.
Okay, so we've been diving deep into Lyotard and Vattimo, but the book also acknowledges that postmodernism has its critics. And I have to admit, I can see how some people might find these ideas a bit unsettling.
That's understandable. It can be challenging to let go of those certainties, those absolute truths that we often rely on to make sense of the world.
Can you tell me more about some of the criticisms of postmodernism? What are some of the main concerns that people have raised?
One of the most common criticisms is that postmodernism, leads to relativism.
Okay.
Undermining the possibility of, rational consensus. And making it difficult to address those social and political issues that require collective action.
Right. So the argument is that if there's no objective truth, then any perspective is as good as any other, and we kind of lose the ability to make moral judgments or take a stand against injustice.
Exactly. And that's a serious concern.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that postmodernism isn't about saying that all perspectives are equally valid or that we should just accept whatever happens.
Right.
It's about recognizing the complexity of those issues.
Okay.
The fact that they're often rooted in conflicting values and beliefs.
So it's not about abandoning our values,
No.
but about being more aware of how those values are shaped by our language, our culture, and our experiences.
Precisely. And I think this is where Lyotard's concept of the different becomes really helpful.
Okay.
It reminds us that those conflicts often arise from those situations where different language games are at play, where different groups are operating from different sets of assumptions and values, and simply trying to impose one set of values on another is likely to lead to further conflict and injustice.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like recognizing that our own perspective is just one among many,
Yeah.
and being willing to engage with those other perspectives, even if they challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah. Exactly. And this can be incredibly difficult work, but it's also incredibly rewarding. It's about building bridges, creating spaces for dialogue, even if we don't always reach complete agreement.
But how do we do that in a world that seems increasingly polarized? Where people are retreating into their own echo chambers and demonizing those who hold different views?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think there are any easy answers, but I do think that postmodernism offers some valuable insights.
Okay.
It encourages us to be more aware of those different language games, to be more critical of those grand narratives that often fuel those divisions, and to be more open to those perspectives that challenge our own.
So it's not about finding some magical solution that will make everyone agree, but about creating a culture of dialogue, of listening, of empathy.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's about cultivating a willingness to understand those who are different from us, to see the world through their eyes, even if we don't always share their perspective.
That's such a powerful message. It's about building bridges instead of walls. But I have to admit, it feels like a daunting task, especially in our current climate.
I hear you. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the negativity and division that we see around us. But I also think there's reason for hope.
Okay.
The very fact that we're having this conversation, that we're grappling with these complex ideas, suggests that there's a desire for something different, for a more nuanced and compassionate way of engaging with the world.
Okay. I'm feeling a bit more optimistic now. It's like even just understanding these postmodern concepts, it gives us a new lens through which to view those challenges, a new set of tools for navigating them.
That's exactly right. It's about expanding our understanding, challenging those old ways of thinking, and being open to new possibilities.
This deep dive has been quite the journey. Like, we're not just exploring these philosophical ideas, but also uncovering new ways of being in the world, new ways of relating to ourselves and to each other.
That's beautifully said, and I think it really captures the essence of what we've been talking about today. Postmodern thought, at its core, is about embracing complexity, challenging those old certainties, and being open to those new ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us. It's not always easy, but as we've seen, it can be incredibly rewarding.
So to our listener, we encourage you to continue exploring the work of Lyotard, Vattimo, and other postmodern thinkers. Don't be afraid to grapple with those challenging ideas and see where they lead you. You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and the world around you.
Remember, as our source so eloquently put it, después todo será diferente. After this, everything will be different. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.